So thank you. Good morning. I'm Lincoln Ellis. I'm the founding, I'm going to take this off, otherwise I'm going to hear myself translated, which is, I've done a lot of TV in my day, but having the producer speak in my ear while I'm speaking is very, very challenging. Anyway, thanks very much for joining me. I'm not sure where Miguel is. Miguel is a banker from Colombia, and we were set to talk about global capital flows. The good news is, in 2 weeks, I will take on an appointment as a senior advisor in Eurasia Group's geopolitical work, which touches quite frequently on just this question of global capital flows. And so I thought we'd take some time. I'll just give some brief remarks to start off, and then we can take the conversation in whatever direction you want to. I think there are lots of interesting avenues to take this conversation. I think it's a very interesting time to both be an entrepreneur and to be involved in cross-border activity from a financial perspective. And so happy to hear what everybody else is up to, and if I can add some color to what any of that, I'd be very, very, very happy to. So I have kind of 3 or 4 themes that I'd like to lay out as guideposts to think about this broader question of global capital flows. The first one actually comes out of COVID, and it's something that we watched happen during the pandemic and then subsequent to this, and this is the reestablishment or the re-regionalization of the world from a supply chain perspective. This is not only from a manufacturing perspective or a delivery of services perspective, but also from a global flows perspective. So people realized or recognized that while globalization was a pretty significant and powerful growth engine in the post-China accession to the WTO in the late 1990s, one of the things we forgot along the way was to build in resilience from a regional perspective and from a size perspective about where and how we deliver capital to entrepreneurs and the next generation of businesses, and to build resilience in critical infrastructure, and whether that be in services or healthcare or the delivery of local food supplies, et cetera. This re-regionalization from a global perspective actually, we think, has been a very positive net development, and it has produced a whole series of micro businesses and entrepreneurial activities across various sectors that I think are ultimately very productive from a sustainability perspective. And so if we think about the re-regionalization of the world in terms of sustainability, that's a really net positive development or silver lining that we can take out. The second thing that I've noticed is the emergence of large versus small. And while I don't think that this is anything particularly new, it's going to become rather acute. I think the place where you see it the most is in the now pervasive conversations around technology and the development of things like artificial intelligence and large language models, and the winners and losers in those worlds that are based on the availability of capital. And while that might be true, certainly from a headline perspective, we do see things, and I remember this from being part of the first tech bubble or revolution in the late 1990s, we do see these moments where the official party line or the headline of large will win begins to unravel itself. And obviously, the last 2 weeks, this conversation with the Chinese AI company DeepSeek has sort of put a prick in the bubble of large versus small and what we can do from a resource perspective in our own backyards with a little bit of ingenuity and perhaps some duct tape and bubble gum. We can talk about duct tape and bubble gum in depth later. The third piece that I think is worth sort of putting on the table is the space between, because these kinds of conversations can get confused from time to time, foreign direct investment, which has been growing at roughly 10% year over year for the past decade. It's kind of plateauing now at, I don't know, 50 billion cross-border activity annually. Sorry, 60. And the emergence of microcapitalism over the last 3 decades in particular. From a regional perspective, certainly in South America and Africa, this has been a huge boon to communities doing all kinds of development work. But the bridge there now is more needed than ever. The space between what governments and intergovernmental agencies do, which is now being questioned by large multinationals like the United States. Obviously, we've seen that conversation emerge center stage with, I don't even know what to call what's going on with the US government at the moment, but it's certainly curious. And then what has been prospering in terms of the development of other alternative sources of capital for folks who are looking to do new things and create more permanent pools of capital for those who need access to them to develop their ideas. I really like the bigger one, but that's right. You laughed too much at that. Anyway. Thank you. The last thing that I think is worth contemplating is, as we sit in this room and think about the businesses that we own or the places where we work or the opportunities that we're trying to avail others of, what is the edge that we have in the worlds in which we traffic? And I would encourage people to think about it from, I think, multiple ways. It's not just, what is my product edge, but what are my edges in terms of people and place? We've been doing a lot of work in the last 6 months with this notion of place-based finance and trying to imagine more permanent pools of capital that are available to low and moderate income neighborhoods, places in zip codes or postal codes where access to capital has traditionally been very difficult, and using technology to understand or animate what those risk factors are in a more nuanced and more thoughtful way. And I think that there is huge promise in developing, along with the technological developments that we're seeing, ways in which we can understand data and de-risk financing new opportunities in ways that we simply haven't been able to before. And so I think that from a multinational perspective is also encouraging, because that allows us to think from a regional perspective in more creative ways as well, which is simply to say, if we were thinking about or watching, say, the top 5 destinations for capital in the world, the United States, the UK, Germany, Singapore, Hong Kong, that those places, that there's room for capital to flow in places where it hasn't in the past, in ways that it hasn't in the past, that will develop new networks and new opportunities for entrepreneurs and business owners that I think will be emblematic of, and I think, quite frankly, the byproduct of what's going on from a geopolitical perspective. If the world is beginning to fragment, if it is continuing to fragment and re-regionalize itself in ways that we haven't seen, say, since the Cold War, what does that ultimately mean for business owners' access to capital and or for companies capacity to grow. And I think there is a silver lining here. I think it means that we as investors can look at opportunities from a regional perspective in ways that we haven't before. It suggests to us that we need to engage from a geographical perspective also in ways that we haven't before. And I think that that's what's so special about gatherings like this, is that part of the process has to be a developing of cultural awareness and understanding that then situates you in the right way to be able to make these investments on an ongoing basis. And whether that's in businesses or in people, 90% of what we invest in is ultimately people. We like the ideas, but ideas are very cheap. It's ultimately people who get them done, and so we need to be investing in people. And that's the real opportunity here, is to take the time to do the travel like we've all done, to come somewhere new and to contemplate what that future looks like in a world that will be slightly unfamiliar to us, certainly relative to, say, the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. So re-regionalization, small versus low, foreign direct or large multinational versus microfinance, and then developing an edge. What are those edges? How do you think about them in terms of your business? And how can organizations either like mine or like the festival be helpful in connecting people and ideas and capital, which was also the name of my podcast in my previous life. So I am happy to open it up for questions. I'd love to hear what's on people's minds. I think this is a super interesting time to both be entrepreneurial and to be contemplating cross-border activity. We're looking at things all the time. So, preguntas para el microphone? That's pretty good, right? Thank you very much. Por favor.
Hello, hello, hello. Yeah? Okay. So in one of the conversations yesterday, we talked about banking. And banks have interestingly, they mediate transactions between people, right? However, there's technologies coming online, fintechs, blockchain, that potentially could sort of remove central banks from person-to-person transactions. So the speaker was talking about that the next, wave is this idea of where I become a direct lender to someone else, and there's infrastructure set up to do so. One of the hard things about investing in micro communities or others is the fact that it's actually pretty hard to do in a way that there is accountability, that there's a way to track payments and things like that. Are you seeing anything or companies developing this kind of stuff that makes the micro investing, say, from the US to a developing nation easier, faster, better at the individual investor level without aggregating on a large basis?
Yes, 100%. I think this is a super interesting development over the course of the last couple of years in ways in which... How are you, Jevin? Nice to see you. Good. Nice to see you. Jevin's joining us. He always sits in front and takes my stuff. So the development of what has been broadly thought of or talked about in terms of the crypto space, I actually like to think of in terms of DeFi, decentralized finance. And that's a more, I think, constructive way to think about the infrastructure, or what generally is talked about in terms of the picks and shovels of being able to revolutionize, once again, this idea of microfinance. And so the disintermediation of the dollar will be something that will be very interesting to watch, certainly over the course of the next 4 years. Because while it is true that the current administration in the United States is quite open to and favorable of developments across the DeFi platform, it has the potential to destabilize the dollar in ways that I can only imagine they have not contemplated.
Lincoln, may I, if I may, jump in quickly? Can you speak about how that will impact local communities? So what does that mean to an everyday consumer that is, you know, maybe walking around with a pocket full of toys, right? And now in their everyday commute, how is that going to impact their everyday life, in their engagements that are happening? And then what I'll add to that is, what does this mean for our 401k? Oh, what does this mean for our 401ks and our Roth IRAs and our investments that we're making for long-term planning for our families?
So I think this is actually very much related, because the infrastructure that gets you from, can I make an investment between myself and what's your name? Ivan. If Lincoln can make an investment to Ivan, and the infrastructure exists there, and the regulatory environment in DC opens up where I can take my Roth IRA money and use that in my digital wallet to make that investment, that unlocks well over multiple trillions of dollars of capital in ways that we have not seen. The people who have been, just quite frankly, sniffing around this area, of course, are our friends in the private equity world, who are very keen to get to our IRAs and our retirement money so that they can have additional sources of fees. I have lots of friends who are private equity people, but yes. The last thing that I want to say about this is that there's still a gap. And I think that my cab ride in last night illustrates this gap. So I went to try, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have any local money. I have some 20s in my bag. But what I really wanted to do was send him Venmo or PayPal or something, right? But he didn't have it. I don't know what the local one is, but, or Nikki, or Revolut or something, if you're in the UK, whatever. So there are still these regional players, or the regionalization of these platforms that doesn't quite get us there. So my suspicion is, both from a regulatory and from a kind of synchronization perspective, we're probably 3 to 5 years away from actually seeing that revolutionize microfinance in a way that I think will be ultimately meaningful. Just one more. I don't want to take up all the time on this, but it's a super interesting question, because there are a number of different projects that are built on either Solana or Ethereum or blockchain technologies that are capable of creating these kinds of intra-person contracts that are being tested out all over the place. And they're being used in insurance to provide crop insurance in sub-Saharan Africa. There's all kinds of projects that are out there looking at ways to facilitate this from a microfinance perspective. It's a super interesting space.
Thank you.
I think there's two, yeah, please. One other thing real quick. Pantera in San Francisco and Galaxy in New York are two places that are sort of under the hood looking at these kinds of.
Good morning, Giada Nicolau with IT Community Trust from IT. Great to be here. I had a question, because as you were talking about the 3 points, when we're thinking about global investment, one of the things you mentioned is about investing on people. And it seems to be one of the areas that it seems like less likely for investors to invest in is on people, in terms of from a cash flow perspective, and because it's hard for you to show the return in investment on people. And I wondered if you can talk a little bit more around that last point that you mentioned about the importance of that, and what does that look like strategy-wise in terms of getting investors to see the importance of investing in the people?
I'm going to add to that, Lincoln, for you to chime in. And as you're talking about investing in people and investing in human capital, what does the future of social impact investing look like as well? Because as we think about building communities and we think about folks that have a charitable mindset, a philanthropic mindset, but is looking for a return on their investment and is looking for that growth, how do we prepare, right, for what is to come and a potentially decentralized market, right? And then how can we enable the current systems that we have in place so that we can build to grow, invest, and support the people that are doing the work and potentially the initiatives that are maximizing impact?
So this question about people is going to become even more and more important as we experience sort of revolutionizing technological developments that eliminate the need for a lot of what we do. And I think I'm of two minds here. The first one is we need to be very clear with ourselves about the need for and the use case around people, bodies, in particular businesses, right? So it's not particularly interesting or fulfilling from a personal perspective. And I have a mother-in-law, who does seasonal, picking at an Amazon warehouse in Nevada. Like, she's 72. She shouldn't be like, that's not, we can automate that. She doesn't need to be doing that. So those are net positive developments. When it comes to developing new business ideas and creating value add in terms of problem solving, I think the need for people will never be greater than it is right now to understand the distinction between what a human is capable of doing and what the machine is capable of doing. You're going to lose the middle tier of worker, which produces all kinds of vertical growth problems. For instance, our business, we have 6 principals, we have no analysts. We don't have any analysts because I can use ChatGPT to do 90% of what I need done, and then I can outsource it to some kind of TaskRabbit service to make it pretty and whatever. So the marginal utility of that is not there, and that step in the ladder is gone. So the need for other kinds of activities to be developed to make a social impact and ultimately reestablish these rungs of the ladder that we've spent the last 100 years building our careers and our businesses and our families and our communities on, is super important.
That is a great point that you bring up, because I think what happens when you talk about the human investment, especially with the point that you just made, we're likely to see a larger and more substantial investment in diversifying education streams. And so education, broadly speaking, is just going to look very different, right? We are still using the same education model from the Industrial Revolution to prepare you to be a factory worker by going to school for 8 hours a day and then preparing you for what that 9-to-5 job is going to look like. And for everyone in this room, we have seen in our lifetimes the 9-to-5 job slowly erode and disappear. And so, like Lincoln just so eloquently highlighted, if that middle rung, that middle tier of employee is replaced or becomes more efficient, more effective in your business, the people aren't going to be replaced, right? The talent is still going to be there, and I think that there is going to be an uprising of individuals that are thinking creatively, thinking differently. We are very innovative as a people. And you will likely see investments in capital that that makes educational resources more accessible to folks across the world, that levels the playing field for folks to think innovatively and to think creatively and to give the space to be creators in their own right. And we're seeing that with, like you said, a TaskRabbit type service or a Fiverr. Like 10 years ago, you couldn't even fathom giving somebody a report that you've never met before and having them write it for you, right? Or edit it for you. And now that's a part of our economy. And I think that those investments are going to continue to happen. And we're going to continue to diversify what work looks like. And that in itself is going to be an investment vehicle for folks that are looking to uplift and build communities. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, I got one after actually. Or do you have something you want to add?
So I think two things: one on the social impact, and one on the education piece. I spent the last 3 years helping one of the world's wealthiest people think about ways in which to sort of treble their impact as they were giving away a significant amount of capital. And this giving away wasn't really a giving it away, but a reinvestment in and the creation of these rungs that are sort of systematically erased via technological developments and or the establishment of capital pools for people who simply haven't had access to them in the past. I think that there's more to do there, and I think people are beginning to get more serious about it because of the work that this family has done. The other piece is, on the education front, the democratization of and the destigmatization of community college, trade schools, all the things that have been animating Europe and European kind of labor pools for all of the post-war period are now happening in America out of necessity. I mean, the lack of skilled tradesmen and women across the United States, we are at a massive, massive deficit. Add on top of that, in the U.S. in particular, immigration-related issues, and you are now looking at serious labor shortages across the board in many different verticals. So this notion that, and in my alma mater, an undergraduate, a little Lutheran school in the middle of Indiana called Valparaiso, these institutions are going to struggle because they're built on this 100-year-old model that it's gone. It's not going to be there anymore. So this is a huge part of the cross-border globalization issue, is a reimagining, certainly in North America, of the education question.
Oh yeah, no, and I think just building on that, right? We are going to see if we do this correctly. Do you have a question? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm an international banker, and the way that I've seen international capital flow has really been with business owners who are looking for a more efficient way of delivering a service or a product to their end users. And sometimes to do that, they need to go outside of the US in order to procure that. And it could be a data center sitting in India. It could be outsourcing their entire financing team to Pakistan. It could be outsourcing the manufacturing process of toiletry products to Turkey. I mean, it really depends on what that business needs in order to deliver the product in the most efficient way to the end user in the US. So the investment of capital that I've seen has been primarily these entrepreneurs seeking opportunities to get that product more efficiently to their end user. And that initial capital flow is really a relationship between finding a place around the world that makes it viable for them to do business in a manner that is not too risky for geopolitical reasons or currency risk or whatever. And that initial investment comes from the entrepreneur. As they get bigger and they become more multinational, the banks start getting involved, and then the banks start financing some of that capital. Again, looking around the world in terms of, okay, where is my risk really at? Because as a bank, it's all about risk, right? So how do I ensure that if I'm going to lend somebody $100 million to invest into Peru so that we can get the berries we need in January in Chicago, how do I ensure that I get paid? If my collateral is sitting in a country that I'm not familiar with, I don't have boots on the ground, and I'm really, really dependent on the cash flow generated of the US company. So as you guys are thinking about how do I invest in capital, my experience has been that you start with an entrepreneur that has a need. And I've seen entrepreneurs build entire economies in villages from nothing. Scrap metal exporters went into the middle of Mexico and say, hey, I have a need and you have a lot of scrap that you're throwing away. How about if you start collecting it and I start buying it from you and okay, then a few years later, I'm going to help you buy the machine to process it. And then I'm going to find a way to sell that. An entire economy just started in a village that didn't have anything. Or coffee importer. I'm going to go to this farm out in the middle of nowhere in Africa, and I'm going to help them understand how to cultivate that bean better so that it's more productive, and I'm going to sell it as a boutique coffee in Seattle. That's been my experience of how this capital flow happened. Anyway, I just wanted to share that. In a very different perspective, right? I understand the big picture and the policies and all of that stuff, but when you're starting from scratch, that's been my experience of what I've seen. And then as you get bigger, then you start introducing the institutional investment.
And what's interesting about that is that that natural progression, because of what's happening geopolitically, puts more emphasis on the local economy. So how do you generate even a market in the place where you used to go to source either a good or a service or a raw material for export or re-import, but how do you create these local economies again with what we're doing from an entrepreneurial perspective?
And we're seeing a shift, right?
Yes.
We're seeing a shift, especially because of COVID, because of supply chain issues. Sorry. You've definitely seen a shift of where they're procuring a lot of these services, right? COVID made everything very hard to get out of Asia, and we were incredibly dependent in Asia in the United States. So we had a lot of entrepreneurs started to shift around, looking for other parts in the world that would be more effective to bring that product in. And you know what? The Americas, being in the same hemisphere, and instead of depending on a boat and depending on rail or truck, became very important. And a lot of those companies that survived during that COVID period were those that had made the shift earlier on, right? It'll be interesting to see what happens when there's a lot of disruption right now with our government about tariffs, right? But tariffs are also an opportunity. So I always try to look for the opportunities against the challenges that come through. And we are in a very unique, well, it's not unique, it happens all the time. But it does allow for an opportunity to be creative of how you get around that. And for those individuals who think ahead, they're the ones that benefit the most.
I mean, shameless plug for the Festival of the Diaspora, right? Where else are we having these types of conversations where we can actually walk down the hall and connect with the local entrepreneurs where we can build economies, right? You see? And so we are the ones that will be building the economies. Like that's just what it comes down to, right? We have a local bra maker right here in the audience who is building accessible bras for folks that are differently abled. And I'm confident that she can walk around to any of those booths and learn something or partner with the local manufacturers that are here in Colombia, right? And the work that she's doing can completely astronomically change the situation that anyone is living in, right? And so I think that what that makes me think of, and y'all don't know my backstory. I'm a social impact consultant, management consultant, communication stakeholder engagement consultant, former lawmaker, and I lead a very large nonprofit in Arizona, early childhood education institution. So I'm constantly thinking about how do we diversify our education streams so that we can prepare our 3 to 5 year olds for a globalized world. And one of the things that I'm constantly thinking about on this exact point is how do we build global citizens, right? And we have to start when they're 3 years old, because by the time they're 5, they're already using AI. By the time they're 7, they're already online. By the time they're 10, they have friends all over the world or access to communicate with folks all over the world. So the world has gotten smaller to the everyday consumer, to the everyday investor, and to the everyday provider. And I think that moving forward, I love how you say the tariffs are an opportunity. Okay. Lucas, can you check on that? Yeah. Oh, perfect. Testing. Great. Yeah, exactly. So the Intercontinental thought it was an opportunity as well. I love how you position the tariffs as the opportunity, simply because nobody in this room are in the room where the decisions are happening right now, right? And what we can say is we can either react to what is happening or prepare for what is going to happen. And if we are preparing for what is going to happen, right, like this is an immense opportunity to invest locally in our own backyard, to develop our own communities, right? Especially how we can revolutionize AI or reposition the intellect that we have in our communities. The opportunity is so vast, but we have to be willing to go out and chase it and be willing to go out and get it. And I think that that's what's going to set people apart. It's not going to be if they're leveraging the tools or the AI, but if we can now reposition our thinking, because we are using that 100-year-old mindset, right? So if we can reposition our thinking to leverage the tools that we have at our disposal, we're going to continue to be unstoppable. And
Just one other thing. Again, this sort of plug for the diaspora and other meetings like this, ask people who they know. Ask people where they're connected. We have, through very odd sets of circumstances, our little team of 6 principals, we have access to the former CFTC Trade Secretary, the current Treasury Secretary, the current Commerce Secretary. If you have an idea that affects policy, and it's right, most of the time we're not in the room, but you can get a note to somebody, like let's start sending notes. Let's start sending notes, but you don't know unless you ask. So when you're with people, I mean, this is the greatest gift that my father, God bless him, ever gave me. He said, don't be afraid to ask. People can say no. People can be offended. People will just be whatever. But ask. It's super, super important.
that is powerful. Do you want that to be your closing remarks? Do you want to add something else to that?
I have nothing else to say.
Y'all, put your hands. So let me just say this, and you heard me. We have to wrap up, so I apologize. For those of you who were there the first night, you heard me in my opening talk, and I talked about how every time that we think that we've measured our capacity to meet a challenge, we will look up and we will be reminded that the capacity is limitless. And like to that exact point, challenge yourself. Put yourself in uncomfortable positions. Ask the hard questions. And sometimes the hard questions is knowing that you're going to get a no, but asking it makes it comfortable for you to develop that muscle. And so keep pushing yourself and find somebody new to connect with. And I'll just tell you, my brother right here sitting to the right of me is a fountain of intellect. This guy is an oasis of opportunity. Lincoln is literally one of the nation's top experts on what he does. So, grab him, talk to him, learn from him, and thank you so much for joining this panel today. I give you all a round of applause because you all are doing the hard work. Be sure to share this on social media, post about the festival, brag to your friends that you're in Medellin having a conversation with one of the nation's expert in an intimate setting, talking about global investments and what the future of our economies looks like. So y'all, it is now time for us to break. Let's head over, grab some coffee, grab some snacks, and then Lucas, we start again at 11. Next panel starts at 11, all right? Thank you all very much and have a great rest of your afternoon.